Welcome back to Tranquility du Jour. I'm your host, Kimberly Wilson. Today we're talking about grief and loss. I invited Lara Casanova onto the podcast to discuss the loss of her father, grief, grace, gratitude, journaling, and how to heal heartbreak. Those of you who are new to Tranquility du Jour, there's a link in the show notes, which can be found at kimberlywilson.com/492. A big thank you for the feedback on Jamia's podcast from last week. I think it was so timely and so beautiful, and I really appreciate all the insights that she shared. And as I thought about which one to share with you this week, I thought grief and loss is so appropriate, considering everything that has been lost through COVID and then now with the murder of George Floyd and the protests around the country. And, it just felt like grief is such a big piece of this, so much sadness, so much outrage. And I think that you're going to find a lot of really helpful tips, hopefully useful tips today from Lara. Also, those of you who are over on the Tranquility du Jour Insiders Facebook group, we're going to be reading White Fragility together, and ideally doing a bit of reading of it this week and then a little discussion over on the Facebook group this upcoming weekend. So for those of you who are interested, please join us. I've downloaded it on Kindle because it's sold out everywhere. And I understand it's a quick read, and it's a wonderful read so far. And it's by a sociologist, and really, really lovely. And I highly encourage you to spend a little time kind of reading all the wonderful anti-racism books that are out there and just learning more. We have so much to learn. I wanted to invite you also to June 21st, the TDJ Live. So these are our seasonal gatherings. They're free, and it's a way to connect and learn 8 tranquility tips for the new season. So I'd love to have you. That's happening on June 21st, which is Father's Day here in the States, and that's from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time. There's a link in the show notes to join us, and you can also find more information about that over at kimberlywilson.com. A big thank you, too, to everyone who is understanding of my need to reschedule last weekend's TDJ Brunch with a side of tranquility. I just felt that there's so many important things that we need to be focusing on right now. And as much as I wanted to come together as a community, I just felt like last weekend was not the right time. So stay tuned for a rescheduled date. And those of you who had signed up, you will be the first to know. And also those of you on my mailing list, which you can sign up for that at kimberlywilson.com/love notes. And I send out just weekly doses of inspiration and invites to all sorts of kind of online events and offerings and podcast links and videos, etc. And I'm delighted to share this week's podcast episode with you. Let's jump in. Lara Casanova is an author, yoga teacher, life coach, and professional counselor, specializing in grief and loss. She holds qualifications in Pilates, remedial massage, and various management modalities, and is an animal enthusiast and a true heartbreak and grief survivor. Through her holistic outlook, seeking nature, self-expression, qualifications, and experiences, she reaches those struggling on challenging journeys to realize their true potential. She's passionate about not only healing from heartbreak and grief, but using the traumatic experience as a learning tool and a gift to visualize, create, and springboard to a brand new, fresh, shiny life. You can learn more about Lara over in the show notes. Delighted to share this episode with you. Let's jump in. Welcome, Lara.
Hello, how are you?
I am good, thank you. It's a delight to have you on the show, and thank you for writing this book, Grief, Grace, and Gratitude, Transforming Through Your Grief Journey. And I know so many listeners here can relate to this. And so tell us a little bit about your journey and what led you to write this beautiful pink book.
Oh, thank you. I'm thrilled to be here. I've always been a bit of a seeker, even though I didn't really know it. And I was in a corporate job for a long time. And at some point, it kind of started to feel like a bit of a soulless existence. And then I went through a relationship breakup as well. So I started to look inside, and my heart kind of led me to know that I needed to invest in self-development, books, courses, counselling, and I just seemed to devour information. I later studied counselling, coaching, business courses, and then more holistic areas like Pilates, massage, and recently yoga. They led me out of the corporate world into the veterinary world, which I loved for over a decade. And then I had another relationship breakdown and sat on my bed with some coloured pencils and a big white book, empty book, and mapped out my first book, Heartbreak, Healing and Happiness. Later left the vet world and my dad passed away, and then I did the same and mapped out my beautiful new book, Grief, Grace and Gratitude. So I kind of then went on a sabbatical and invested my time in my book, and it's been just a beautiful journey. The depths of sorrow alongside the height of beautiful love.
Yeah, I mean, that's the challenge, right? It's like with grief is that, it's so, I mean, we're so blessed to have been able to have loved so deeply, and yet just the pain is so intense. And, at the start of your book, you've got your pink treasure box of tools. Can you speak a little bit to those?
I believe that when we go through the grief journey, we need to contemplate, we need to ponder, we need to gaze inwards and look at ourselves and walk to the center of our pain before we can walk out the other side to find the love. And to do that, we need to journal, we need to contemplate the things that are coming out of our heart, asking ourselves some questions like, what does my grief feel like? Where is it sitting in my body, and what does it want me to do today? What is it teaching me? So the pink treasure box of tools in the book guide you through some questions and some tips and journaling, and just enabling you to get in touch with your heart and how it's feeling, so you can draw out that grief and walk to that pain to walk through to the other side.
Yeah, grief is so, just like hearing you talk about this, it's just such a challenging beast. And, even asking like, where do you feel it in your body? One of the things that I notice with grief is it just feels like I'm encased in concrete. Like it's just so heavy.
Yes, that's right. And it's a real dichotomy, because you've got the devastation of the grief and the beauty of the love, which makes us human. And I know when I went through it, I felt it a lot around my heart and my throat area. And it was like, and I have got an Italian background, but it was like I felt like I was, really living my Italian heritage, and I would be howling, and it was like this sense of all this energy and this grief coming almost from low down in my abdomen up to my heart and my throat, and moving it out as an energy out of my body. And I would howl often, and I had never done it before. This is after my dad's passing, which is what the book is written about, like the backdrop of the book. And it was very difficult and very frightening at some points, because it was so intense.
I think howling is such I totally get it. It is. It's like, it's a totally different type of crying.
Yes, it is. It's very deep and it's very scary, but it's that depth of that, the grief that helps the healing. And it really moves that energy through and creates, in time, I believe, more of a lightness within when you get a little bit further through the process of grief.
Now, tell us a little bit about your journey when you lost your father, and what was the hardest part there?
I think the hardest part for me was coming to a form of acceptance. Now, I know acceptance comes along later in the grief journey. However, I would sit on my bed with the little funeral card with his picture on there and the beautiful words on the back. I can't remember what they were now, and I would just sit there and go, I can't believe this is my dad on this little funeral card. I've been to many other funerals, and just getting that sense of reality. This is my new reality and I need to live it. And every night I would do that for months and months, just still not being able to come to terms with the fact that that was my dad and he wasn't here anymore. And he was one of my most favorite people in my world. So that was probably the hardest part, was just really coming to that sense of getting it to be a reality. And we know denial is one of the first steps in the grief process. So it took me a long time to sort of come out of that. And there were many other very difficult things, but I think that was probably one of the hardest.
And what would you say so you've got the book divided into 3 parts, right? The grief, the sabbatical, the rebirth. So let's talk about, a little bit about the grief, right? So you've got the 5 stages of grief listed, which, are always like kind of the go-tos. Have you ever heard of Warden's 4 tasks of grieving?
No.
Yeah, so that's another kind of theory, and I use it a lot with pet loss and grief, but it's a really interesting one, and it's not so much about stages, meaning like you could do this and this and this. There are 4 tasks, and they can be done in any particular order, and it's things like adjusting, accepting the reality of the loss, adjusting to the environment without this being, keeping a common connection with the being while also moving forward with your life. Like it's really interesting. And listeners, I'll put a link in the show notes about that. But,
yes.
I think 5 stages of grief is definitely much more, well known. And so can you talk a little bit about these 5 stages and what you've observed kind of moving through them?
Yes. Well, I use the 5 stages of grief were definitely something I traveled through. So denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And I spent quite a lot of time in denial. Anger, not so much. A little bit. I sort of had this sense of all this busy energy inside a lot of just not knowing where to go and what to do and how to be. And my ground felt very unstable and I felt very unsettled, and I'm not sure what stage that fits into. It might just be the overarching feeling of it. But what I also found, I went through, excuse me, a different kind of set of stages that I created myself, which I called In the Pink process, In the Pink because that's the name of my business, but which sort of team in with the 5 stages, but mine were awareness, taking responsibility for your grief and moving through that, and feeling, forgiving and accepting. So it's kind of similar, but that was the process I really went through. I had to take awareness that I was grieving. I then had to take responsibility and own it rather than apportioning any blame outwards, say, to anyone else. So that made me sit in the responsibility, and then feeling every feeling that came up and acknowledging them all and holding space for each of those feelings. And then forgiveness for some areas that I needed to look at for being hard on myself. And then finally the acceptance came. So I used both of those processes together to come out the other side.
Yeah, I like that. I like the kind of creating your own, taking from different experts, quote unquote, kind of in the field, and seeing what resonates with you, and really and what works, And I think every loss is unique. But have you heard the idea too of cumulative grief?
Yes, and I found that when I lost my dog. If I'm thinking along the same lines in the interpretation of it. When I lost my dog, which was before my dad, and I've since written a book on pet loss as well, which is being edited now, but I suffered extreme grief when I lost my dog, and it was because there was all this grief that had built up over the years that I hadn't dealt with. So when my dog passed away, all of a sudden everything presented to be dealt with, and it was very, very difficult. However, when I lost my dad a little later, I call it more of a clean grief because I dealt with all of the other built up grief when my dog passed away. And then when I had to deal with dad's grief, it was really just dealing with his grief because everything else I'd kind of processed to a point that I was in a reasonably good place. So is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, well, the idea that each loss kind of builds on the other, right? Which is exactly, I think, what you're saying. And I don't know that a lot of people know about this concept because it's, I don't feel like we really learn much about it. I mean, maybe if you dig deep into exploring grief or reading about grief, but, I just thought it helped explain a little bit about why, like it just is so intense. And, as you say, pet loss, I can't wait to have you back on the show to talk about that book. But, that is such extreme grief because we don't have any grudges that we're holding against our pets. It's unconditional love. They're a part of our everyday routine. Whereas, a parent or a sibling or, a beloved friend, even though they may be part of our daily routine, they're probably not in our homes and, necessarily being part of that routine the way our world's going to revolve around when our dogs need to eat. So it's just an interesting difference, too, I think with loss. But yeah, how it builds on each other is painful.
And I think that's the really important part about grief, is that we need to walk to that epicenter of the pain with each situation and each experience of grief and clear it as best as we can. Because if we skirt around the edges and repress and suppress, it does wait there, and grief does wait for us. And everyone says that time heals all wounds. And I believe that statement in part. It heals all wounds, but only if we do the work as well as giving it the time. If we give it the time and we don't do anything about it, we're going to still be in the same place months later, maybe years later, when that grief hasn't been processed. And so to walk into that pain that's sitting in the center of our heart can be absolutely unbearable. Yet once we do it, it gently moves and it softens and it lightens, and we come out, I believe, and I've experienced this on numerous occasions, with more love in our heart, with more appreciation and gratitude for life and our loved ones and ourselves. And we become more strong and resilient because we know we've coped with that. And you may find, if you talk to any older people, I have a beautiful auntie who's 87, and she said you learn as you go through life how to deal with grief each time it presents. And the older you get, almost not the easier, but it becomes you become more knowledgeable maybe at how to process it. And you know how to deal with that, and you've dealt with more grief as you go. So I really think we do need to sit with each experience with grief and almost remove ourselves from our lives for a little bit, even if only for half an hour a day. I was lucky to go on almost a year sabbatical with mine, sit in beautiful basilicas around Rome and contemplate my grief. Not everyone can do that, but it needs to be done in some form so we can process that grief and move through it to find that love again.
And when you talk about kind of going into the epicenter of the grief, can you walk us through that? Like, how do you recommend we do that? Because I love that idea.
So I think what a lot of us do, we just keep busy, we avoid, and we suppress and repress. So we look for something externally to take us away from our grief. And we run and we hide a little bit from it. And that is the normal human condition as well. So to come to the epicenter of the pain, it's about turning inwards rather than turning outwards. So by turning inwards, for me, I'm a yoga teacher as well. So it's been a lot about sitting with our heart. Now, to sit with the heart, the easiest way I found to do that was to go into meditation. Even just sitting and repeating inhale on the inhale, exhale on the exhale. Once we can calm our thoughts and that chitter chatter in our mind, we can find a little bit more about what is actually really happening within us and get in touch with those feelings. We can also do that through writing, through journaling, even writing a letter to our loved one or to ourselves, maybe through prayer, maybe through writing a personal tribute. Sometimes listening to music can draw up emotions, artwork, anything creative really does that. It's about getting into our creative side, not shutting the mind down, but just allowing it to be there, allowing the thoughts to rise and fall as they always will, because that is just what happens, but not attaching to those thoughts, as you would know, Kimberly, a very common yoga theme, just not judging or attaching our thoughts and sitting with our heart.
And, this piece about the sabbatical, I also really love and appreciate that. Whenever I lost my grandmother in 2012, I actually went on a bit of a semi-sabbatical with, away from day-to-day operations at the studio. And it's a really powerful thing to be able to pull away from the busyness to actually just be in the grief. And so can you speak a little bit to that piece of, like, what could a sabbatical look like for people who can't necessarily escape, so to speak?
So sabbatical is a lovely thing to be able to do. And as I said, I took a year on a sabbatical. I did yoga teacher training, dived deep into myself, went to Rome, investigated and walked around Rome in my heritage, since it was my dad who I had lost. And then I came back and wrote my book. Now, so I was almost a bit of like an eat, pray, love journey for a year. Not everyone can do that. If they can, I suggest it, because it's about following your yearnings. And it was my heart that led me to do all those things. I just listened intensely, and that's where it led me. Someone else, it might look like you may have a full-time job. You may not be able to do those things, but you may be able to come home at night and close the door for half an hour every night and schedule that time just for you, maybe with some candles or some oils, or creating an altar with pictures of your loved one and things that are symbolistic of that relationship, and spending some time with it. It might be connecting to nature every day. I walk every day with my dogs, but even if you don't have a dog, it might be going out into nature and grounding and taking our shoes off and earthing with our feet into the ground. Just anything we can get that we can ground and we can connect and we can come back to ourselves. And we're so far removed from ourselves in this world at the moment. And I almost think COVID has given us some gifts in that it's helped us slow down a little bit. And I know for me, it's reconnected me to my heart, just being at home and looking for some things to do that create a bit of a purpose. So maybe creating a purpose around our grief, in that really using it as an opportunity to journey inwards. I think that's what's most important.
When you talk about that, right, with the importance of journaling, and I do think journaling is such a powerful piece. And you also mentioned other tools. So can you speak a little bit to journaling and some of the other tools that you recommend that help the grieving journey and process?
Well, journaling is probably my go-to. It's so cathartic. I would find words would just appear in front of me that I wasn't even fully aware of. And sometimes it would happen after listening to some music or sitting still. And it gives an opportunity to express and move the words and the feelings out of the body and the mind, and knowing oneself a little better and creating a bit more authenticity. And some other things, I mentioned a few early, but you also may have, like a memory jar was a really good one that I didn't actually use, but I read about afterwards, and writing down a memory and putting it in a jar. And then when we're feeling a little sad or distant, is removing one of those memories and reading it. Photos is another good one. I put some photo collections together. I went through all my photos and I pulled out the ones that were really meaningful to me, and there were a lot of them. And then I collated them all into some albums. So I'd be able to sit there and just go through the photos. And I've still got albums on my phone that I look at often, even 4 years later. A personal tribute is another tool that is amazing, and I detail that in my book. I call it The Path of Goodbye, and I talk about each different stage that I went through leading up to even the anticipated grief before Dad went through his final day, his final breath, the funeral afterwards. And I discuss my experience, and then I give the readers an opportunity to share their experience. So creating a personal tribute, and then also creating another maybe document around them, their likes, their dislikes, their family, other family, just a little bit more about them, so you can immerse in their energy and their personality. So there's lots of different things you can do, and I talk a lot about, more in the book. But again, it comes back to that creative nature, that getting in touch with ourselves and how we can express that through our heart. And every heart wants to express a little differently, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. That's right. There's no process, one size fits all, but it is, these are all great ideas and tools. It's just reminders of how to kind of work through it. Now, one of the things that I think is really challenging, and that I see a lot with people after they've lost someone or a being, such as a beloved pet, is a lot of regret. Like, oh, I said this, or I did that, or I didn't take them on enough walks, and so how do you encourage people to forgive themselves for, being human, right? And after this beloved being is gone?
I think the biggest thing for me revolves around kind of one thought or perception is that we all do the best we can with what we know. So it's finding that forgiveness and accepting that none of us intentionally generally do the wrong thing. We try and live our best lives, and sometimes we yell at our children or our family or even our dogs, and then we feel bad. But it's coming back to that point that we are doing the best we can, and we need to acknowledge that we do live in a reasonably stressful world. So sometimes we do let slip, and we do maybe do something that we regret a little later. But just being gentle with ourselves and introducing some self-love into the process also helps forgiveness, because forgiveness is very tricky. We can think about maybe how we forgave other people in the past, and maybe then turning that around and using that for ourselves. If I asked you how you forgave your best friend for something that they did, then maybe being able to use that back towards us, because we're very hard on ourselves. I think it's harder to forgive ourselves than others. We're very tough on ourselves most of the time. So it is very tricky forgiveness, and it's gentle, and it's about being self-loving to ourselves.
Yeah, and self-love is something that you definitely mention and talk about. And how do you feel like that helps in the grieving process? I mean, it sounds like being gentle with ourselves and forgiving ourselves for being human.
Well, self-love is something I struggled with for a long time in my younger years. And I've learned that it brings alignment with the body and the mind and the heart. And we can live more with peace and calmness. And self-love is learning to say no and making decisions that are right for us, and willing to look inside with self-trust and belief, with the capacity to love and respect ourselves. And here we go to forgive ourselves, and removing any drama and reducing stress. There's so many different things, and we can do that by, getting a good night's sleep and nurturing ourselves, giving ourselves that half an hour a day to sit with our grief, and just slowing down a little bit and thinking about how we would treat and look after a newborn puppy or a newborn human, and just that kindness around dealing or looking after them, and then being able to send all of that kindness and that love back towards ourselves. And we have a lot of beliefs and values that could be a little skewed from how we're brought up, and everyone's got different things that have happened to them in their life. But there is that opportunity to change some of those beliefs. And I listened to a podcast with Louise Hay yesterday, and the whole, you can change your thinking, you can heal your life. And it is so true. It's just about changing that thinking and allowing ourselves to be more self-loving to heal the grief.
Right. I love that idea of like the tenderness, that you would give towards a puppy and a newborn.
Yeah.
What about gratitude? You talk about this in the book as another big healing tool. And can you speak a little bit to how that plays in?
Well, gratitude in itself can make us feel more positive and, can boost our well-being, and it has a lot of positive outcomes from, research that you read about it. And it can just make us feel more appreciative of our lives and what we have. And when we go through the grief and we find the love, that's when the gratitude surfaces. It like slowly comes up saying, oh my God, how lucky were we to have that person in our lives? It's like Winnie the Pooh's quote, and it's one of my favorite ones. How lucky am I to have something that makes saying goodbye so hard? And it's like to be grateful for everything that we have still with that person. They're still with us. They're still in our hearts. We still have our memories, and we still have the love. The love never dies. And for me, love is the whole point. After writing the whole book, that's what came up for me. Love is the point, and it is there if we journey through this grief. And the gratitude is part of that love. And we then can become more purposeful and find a purpose behind our loss that might help move us forward a little. And sometimes people find amazing opportunities to change their lives and the lives of others, and even the world sometimes, through a loss, with charities and different things that they birth because of, I might be going a bit off track here, but I think that some of the gratitude and having moved through the grief, they find a purpose. and that keeps us connected to our loved one.
Yeah, no, I think that's totally on track. And I totally agree that, people go on to, such as yourself, like write a book or start nonprofits, do all sorts of, or just memorials or plant, a garden, a memorial garden, or like get a bench, for the person's name. I mean, there's all sorts of things I think that people can do to express gratitude toward that being. And that also leads them down a new path. It definitely shifted my focus.
It does. It shifts your world. And I think that's what I also went through with Dad. It really shifted my world, and it still does. And I'm actually quite a different person now, but I think I'm more loving and more calm and more forgiving and more, maybe I've just wisened up a bit as well, but there's a softness in me that maybe wasn't there quite so much when I was in my 20s and 30s. And it's the love. It's that love that kind of laces my heart from him, and losing him creates more love, I think. And yeah, so it's a really tricky time, but it's such a beautiful time as well.
Well, my last question for you, Lara, is around the name of the podcast, Tranquility du Jour. And I'm curious, how do you in Australia find tranquility in your everyday life?
Well, I love the Tranquility du Jour, and I've followed you for some time. And I think in my life, I think for me it was about going into the heart. It's about journeying inwards to the center of my heart. And I do that mainly through yoga and through meditation. And when I journey inwards, I find those footsteps that I can follow that lead me out. And that pretty much for me is yoga and meditation that has really facilitated that for me to a depth that I am so grateful for. And yeah, I think that would be my biggest one. There are many others, but that would be the one I'm most grateful for.
And when can we expect your next book?
My next book, Loss, Love and Lessons, Healing Pet Loss and Grief, is in the process right now of cover design. It's all edited and ready to go, but I thought I would wait till our COVID is over, because I always have a big launch and I really don't want to miss out on the big party with all my friends and family and supporters here in Adelaide. So depending on how long that goes out on for, but I'm hoping in the next 6 months maybe will be released, and then moving on to maybe another book on finding your purpose after that. So busy.
Beautiful. I love it. Thank you so much, Lara, for sharing your wisdom and this beautiful book and the work you put out into the world.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. It's been such an honor to be here on your show. I love what you do, and I think that you are such a light in the world, and you're one of my mentors, and I think that we all need to be a light and generate peace into our chaotic world, especially right now. So thank you, everyone, for listening.
Mentioned in the podcast, Warden's 4 Tasks of Grief. There's also a link to Lara's website, lifeinthepink.com.au, her email address, Amazon to find her books, Facebook, and Instagram. Also, there's links to connect with the Tranquility du Jour Insiders Facebook group. Would love to have you over there. Also, if you have a moment to share a review of this podcast, I'd be so grateful. My hope is that it helps other people find more tranquility in their everyday. And also to find more episode of Tranquility du Jour. Of course, you can find that over on iTunes and at KimberlyWilson.com/podcast. We also have an iPhone and Android Tranquility du Jour app. If you would like to subscribe, you can do so in Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or Overcast and never miss an episode. Also, there's a link to my 6 books, ways to find me online, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and then also a link to my locally sewn eco-friendly clothing line, Tranquility. I hope you enjoy the information in this episode. Thanks for inviting me and my guest into your day. Again, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Have a great week.